Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to the Galway Chamber Autumn Business Lunch. My name is JP Gilmartin, Chamber President, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our first ever virtual Autumn Business Lunch, kindly supported by Grant Thornton, with our guest speaker today, Pat McCann, the CEO and founder of the Dalata Group. Grant Thornton are long-standing supporters of the Chamber, and they're deeply embedded in economic activity in this region and the city. And we thank them most sincerely for their continued support of the Chamber and its activities. We're very fortunate to have someone of Pat's calibre and business standing being so giving of his valuable time today. And I certainly look forward to hearing his thoughts on themes of resilience, leadership, and infrastructure as part of this afternoon's discussion. When I was planning for my term as Chamber President, I never thought that my first business lunch would be held online, but we're delighted to see so many familiar faces this afternoon, and I suppose it shows the power of our local business network here in Galway, and also that the promise of a hot lunch wasn't the only draw in the past. That said, I'm extremely proud to be part of an organisation that, like so many others, have had to pivot as a result of the most recent pandemic. And this event is one of just over 70 events that the Chamber have hosted online since March of this year. This afternoon, the format of our business lunch will be a fireside chat between Angus and Pat, and those attending will have the opportunity to ask questions through the chat function on Zoom. I'd like to introduce Angus Burns, an advisory partner with Grant Thornton, specialising in restructuring and corporate finance. In Galway, Grant Thornton employs a local team of over 100 people in audit, tax and consultancy services as part of a wider national firm network with offices in Dublin, Belfast, Cork, Limerick, Longford and Kildare. Angus sits on the Board of Directors of Galway Chamber and is currently the Deputy President of the Chamber also. Turning to Pat, Pat has almost 50 years of experience in the hotel industry, having embarked his career in 1969 with the Ryan Hotels. Pat founded the Dalata Group in February of 2007 and became the CEO of that company in August of that same year. He's a non-exec director of a number of private companies, and he was Deputy President of IBEC in 2018, President in 2019, and as I understand it, Pat, just recently that appointment has come to an end. Pat has held a number of non-exec positions within the hospitality and other industries, including state and public companies. He's formerly a director of the EBS Building Society, Green Core Group and the Whitfield Private Hospital in Waterford. Pat has served as the National President of the Irish Hotels Federation, was a member of the National Tourism Council and is a member of the Irish Tourism Review Group. I suppose with that breadth of experience across so many sectors, I personally am really looking forward to hearing the direction of this afternoon's discussion between Angus and Pat. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Angus at this stage to maybe better introduce Pat. Thank you.
Thanks, JP, and to Kenny and Colleen for organising today. You're all very welcome to our lunchtime chat. I'm not sure where the fireside is. We've done away with that now. We're all high tech now, is that right, Pat? So our guest today, Pat, is someone very well known to me. I've worked with him for a number of years. It's been a bit of a roller coaster at times. I think that's fair to say, Pat. I think he embodies the power of leadership and resilience in good times and bad. The ability to guide managers along a strategic path, 5-10-year plans to get out of a mess. We're in another mess now, Pat. And to grow a business through strategic innovation, adaptability, survival, keeping the head, reassuring stakeholders, management alike, that the future is great. Because I think if you believe the future will be great and you act on it, then I think through thick and thin, I suppose it will be great. So when I think of that kind of view, I think our speaker today embodies a lot of that. And I suppose if as Pat did, you know there's a business demand in your country, in your city. and you can build the infrastructure to bring that business to your city and allow industry to thrive, creating employment, circulating money, supporting families, young people, old people, citizens to live fulfilling lives, then really I think that's what it's about. And I think that kind of, those challenges sound familiar for the citizens of Galway at the moment. And look, hopefully we'll get some ideas from Pat as to how we can overcome some of our local issues. And look, if you can deliver infrastructure and facilitate business demand and create that kind of platform, whether you're in the private sector or the public sector, then I think you're the hero then. So look, enough said on that. You know where I'm going in the context of Galway. We'll get plenty of ideas from Pat today. And Pat, you're very welcome to, I was going to say welcome to Galway, but I suppose you're welcome to the Galway ether and this virtual lunchtime chat. I thought lunch was being delivered actually to the office here, but I know that's not the case. I know you're a big fan of tech, so when you work out how to deliver lunch virtually, Pat, you'll tell us all, won't you?
Absolutely, Angus.
But you're fond of the west of Ireland as well. You're South Sligo man.
Yeah. So just a little bit of history on where I come from, because I think in the context of everything and the way life shapes you, where you come from is very important, and never forget where you came from. So I was born in South Sligo, in small farming country, where nobody was rich. We were all in the same boat. We all had to struggle to survive, but we were a very resilient community, and I'll put it that way, where lots of sharing went on. And like when I think back to my very younger days, we were mainly self-sufficient, particularly during the summer months. We bought very little except what you would call the staples like flour and sugar and salt and tea. Tea was very important, no coffee. But everything else you provided, you grew everything. And that's the way life was. And we all lived that life. But it's a great thing to shape you and make you be resourceful in your life. And it doesn't matter where you end up, you will always have that resourcefulness. And I suppose when I think of myself, like I was 8 years of age before we got electricity. And I know now when you look at technology, and here we are, you know, doing a Zoom call to all of the good in Galway. And essentially, you know, that in my youth, nothing like this obviously ever existed. But it again kind of gives you an appreciation about what's happening and what's happening in the world. And also it gives you a clear understanding that you have to keep relevant, because one of the problems that happens to people is that they go through a phase and then they stop kind of evolving themselves, and then you don't be relevant anymore. So even for an old codger like me, it's critically important that I stay relevant. And where I am actually today is out in Skerries in North Dublin. I haven't left the county, and I'm dealing with the technology company that supplies HR, rostering, all of that type of system to the hospitality sector. So it's about me keeping myself relevant in the scheme of things. But I suppose the thing about me is that I was 51 years working at the end of June this year. Actually, the date, the 29th of June, and ironically, that was the date we opened all the hotels in Ireland after lockdown. And I've spent all of my life, or virtually all of my life, in PLC world. And that's unusual in the hotel sector, because we've only ever had 3 listed hotel companies in Ireland. And that was, obviously, I spent 20 years with Ryan Hotels. I spent 17 years with Juries. And then I've spent the last 13 years, obviously, with Dalata since it was founded back in 2007. So I've lived in PLC world. That's where I exist.
And the first gig was I know you were so Sligo, you were close to Ballymote, so you made your way all the way into Sligo town. What was it? Was that what organisation was that now?
So when I started first back when I was 16, well, just gone 15 actually, it was the Yates Country Hotel in Ross's Point, now owned by the McNiff family, across the road from Ross's Point Golf Club, and I was a kind of even in that stage of my life as an entrepreneur, because I used to do a lot of night porter work in the beginning, and on my way home up to where I was staying, I used to go through the golf course, and I used to find all the lost balls because I knew pretty much where they'd end up, and I used to bring them back into the golf club when I had enough and sell them back to them, you know. So even in my early years, I was an entrepreneur trying to make a few bob, you know, and a few bob to me was very important in those times. So.
And the smaller hotels, then you say keeping relevant, like what was there a relevance from, you know, the experiences in the small hotels up to, I suppose, what you're doing today? Like I know you come out with a really interesting phrase sometimes that, and I'll surely get this wrong, but that now you're in the business of hotels. Is it not in the business of?
So I'm not in the hotel business, I'm in the business of hotels. And essentially, when you're in PLC world, we have to have the same rigors as Smurfits or CRH or anybody else for that matter that exists in the PLC world. So it is a business. We have to come out every 6 months with our results, and we have to abide by all the good corporate governance and all of the things. So it makes it a very definitive business. I suppose that's what I've done all my life. And when you like that space, it can be very good for a business to have that public listing. So, for example, only a matter of weeks ago, we went out and we raised an additional 94 million in equity, which kind of bolsters our balance sheet. If you weren't in the public market, it mightn't have been that easy to go out and raise capital at this point in time. But because you're in the public markets, I would say it's relatively easy to do.
So I mean, just in terms of where we're at, you talk about raising money. I mean, there's a specific requirement to raising money at the moment because of the crisis that we're in. Like I first came across Dalata back in 2009. I think it's safe to say that, because time has passed and we're on to another crisis since. But Dalata was, I'd never heard of Dalata before, but they were in the depths of a crisis then, and I was actually talking examinership to your owners, and even though you didn't go that route, you came up with a really clever business strategy that I'd really like you to talk about. But was that like there's another crisis now we're in the middle of, but was that the first real crisis in your career, or were there other kind of crises that you had to deal with?
I'd love to say that was the first, but actually about every 10 years there's been a crisis. So shortly after, when I came full-time into the business back in 1969, we had the oil crisis, and everybody thought that the world was going to end, and you know, people were abandoning cars, and because there simply was no fuel, like there was no business around, so it was a pretty tough time. And then you got into the early 80s, where you had a pretty steep recession, and Ireland, you see, people have forgotten like what Ireland was in the 70s and 60s, 70s and 80s, and that it was a very insular country, and we had very little going for us except our indigenous businesses. That's all changed now, thankfully, and we're much more outward look. So when recession hit in the early 80s, it was pretty devastating for the Irish economy. And then you started into the early 90s, you had the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and the Libya crisis, and that made no Americans travel. And then you got into the early 2000s, where you had the dot-com bubble burst, you had 9/11, you had the second Gulf War, and then of course you got into the financial crisis. But if you add all of those crises together, they don't add up to the effects of COVID. It's a very different space. And COVID has meant that for the first time in my life, I've had to close hotels. And that's been the devastating part. But like everything in life, you always prepare for these events. And any company that doesn't have a contingency or a preparation or a plan, then they're going to end up in trouble. So we always, for example, in Dalata, have structured our balance sheet to be very cautious and to make sure that in that caution that we have a number of things, that we have a good bit of asset ownership. So currently we have about 1.2 billion of assets on the balance sheet. We had I suppose, over 100 million in cash. We have 110 million undrawn facilities, and I raised another 94 million. So I have 300 million at my disposal today, which means that Dalata is in a very strong position to weather anything anybody wants to throw at us. And that comes about by the fact that we have learned over the years that if you don't prepare for these events, you're going to end up in trouble.
But I suppose there's, and I know you've been quoted this week in the papers, there's an opportunity there as well, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, going back to the financial crash, as we tend to call it, and I remember, Angus, the first time I met you, it was in a field in Castlebar, where we were involved in a hotel that had, let's say, a little bit of a challenge with its sewage system.
And a hotel on steroids, from what I remember.
A hotel on steroids, and of course no infrastructure. So that was the first time I met you. And I suppose what Dalata has always been good at is taking advantage of the crisis. And like back then, we worked with you, with other receivers at that point in time, and we managed just under 40 hotels on behalf of banks and receivers. And that really set us on the path that we're on today, where we became the largest operator. By 2010, we were the largest hotel operator on the island of Ireland. And then, of course, we took full advantage as those same banks started to sell off hotels. And we were able to buy them at well below replacement cost. So again, it was being in the right place with the right resources to do that. And the reason we were able to buy them is because we floated the business in 2014, and that allowed us to raise just over 800 million in debt and equity. And we quickly set about spending that money buying hotels, and particularly existing hotels, both in Ireland and the UK. So we've taken advantage of every crisis so far.
My recollection of 2009 to 2014, and it was great fun working with you and the team. But you kept that team together, and we were only just chatting before the call. Like the two Stevens, Sean, Duncan, they're all still there. And I thought it was brilliant, and we've seen it with local businesses as well who flourished in the last couple of years, and through the last financial crisis, they kept that team together. But at the time when you were working the 40 hotels, the management contracts, creating new income streams where you were still dealing with your balance sheet problems, was the 2014 access to the markets, was that always the target, or were you just making it up as you went along?
No. So when I formed Dalata back in 2007, I suppose Dalata came around. I had essentially retired from juries, and I thought it'd be nice to take life easy and do. I thought I had a few bob after selling all my share awards and juries, and life was great. But of course, I put it all into bank shares and property, and we all know what happened that back in 2008. But essentially for me, and I was doing consultancy, which I detested, because the problem with consultancy is you can make all these recommendations, but in reality, you're not actually making things happen, because if people don't listen to you, nothing gets done. And then when I got an opportunity to start Dalata, and it was driven by the fact that I had built up Juries Inns in the Juries Group right from inception. Actually, the first Juries Inn to open was in Galway down by Spanish Point, or Spanish Arch. I keep calling it Spanish Point. I'm mixing it up with Clare, but Spanish Arch. And essentially from there, we built a great brand up kind of almost 30 hotels. And I was involved in the actual construction of virtually all of them. And of course, really what got up my nose was when somebody said to me that was a bit of a fluke, you know, you were lucky, things happened for you. And that was enough to get me going. So I had this idea that I would rebuild another company to prove to this miserable, what I won't call him because we're in public domain, but anyway, you get my drift, that this wasn't a fluke at all, and we could do this again, which is exactly what we've done. And I was lucky that a lot of the team that I had in juries with me moved across into Dalata as well. So some of the people have been with me over 30 years, which and that'll be surprising to people because I am not the easiest person in the world, and I demand my pound of flesh. But to be fair to people, I give them great autonomy, and they make a lot of decisions themselves. But then they have to deliver. They're actually responsible.
But Pat, you're to be fair though, the timing of Dalata and Maldron, etc., was like you were right at the height, and then what happened? You know, asset prices dropped hugely, turnover profitability dropped hugely, and unlike today, there was no credit. There was no credit out there. So, did you always believe that you'd get through it to the 2014 stage?
Oh, absolutely. And just to kind of look back again, like we were in Dalata even at 2007. We were well capitalized. Like the starting fund for Dalata was about 45 million, and there was about 15 million in debt, and the rest was in equity. So we were well capitalized. So we didn't have an issue around debt or repayments of debt. I suppose what we had taken on was a number of long-term leases, which were way over leased. And that was really what was creating the problem for us in Dalata at that point. But we knew very clearly we'd get out of this very quickly. And I suppose from our perspective, we would examine all options open to us depending on what we found ourselves in. But, you know, you talked about looking at examinership, and we did. But the reality for us is that we were nowhere near having to do that. But like everything we do in Dalata, we plan it well ahead. We don't, there's not a knee-jerk reaction to anything. And I knew that by getting the management contracts, that would put us on a very different structure. And actually, we were more profitable in 2010 than we were in 2007. So for us, it meant that we had turned the corner very quickly, and we never missed a heartbeat in terms of an interest payment or anything else like that.
And how do you like you kept that team together, and they're all great guys. I know them very well, but how do you keep them believing in the plan? I mean, that you might say, look, you know, you bounce back to Dalata, but in reality, it took 5 years to get between 2009 and 2014. We're hoping the COVID crisis is a lot quicker, and you might talk to that later. But just on that 5 years, how do you keep the team believing in the plan and sticking with it?
Well, you know, one of the things we saw, and we saw it very quickly, was that recovery really started in 2011, and we could see that happening. And you see, one of the things to understand about the Irish economy, we essentially have two economies, and Galway is a great example of this, where you have the FDI economy, which is so critically important to us, and you have the domestic economy, whereas the world we exist in. But actually, we exist in some of the FDI stuff as well, because a lot of our good corporate customers come from the FDI sector. And having those two things, and we were able to see what was happening in that sector. And that's why when you look at commentators on how quickly Ireland bounced back from the crisis, it was really down to the structure of our economy. And I don't think we give that enough attention around the need to have both of those working together. And we have great examples even in today's world where, you know, every time the exchequer numbers come out, I'm surprised that people are surprised at how good the numbers are. But they forget one element, is that we have an FDI economy that is working exceptionally well. And we need to nurture and take care of that and show them the love, for want of a better word. And I sometimes think, I hear commentators out there, and it really annoys me that people feel that you know, we could get on without this. We cannot. It's a critical part of our economic makeup. And equally, we need to then help the domestic economy where we have the balance of the two.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the FDI, and I mean, it's really mostly from the United States, but it's been fundamental in underpinning our economy. And we look around Galway at many successful businesses in Galway, but they're tapped into FDI. FDI are comfortable that they're not just setting up a forwarding plant and shipping everything in from outside. They're working with partners locally to in the value chain and in terms of supplying services. And in terms of Dalata, like, as you know, I did a piece of work with a client recently who's an investor in your business, and what really surprised me was the amount of your business, which is corporate clients. You already mentioned it. It's very, very significant part of the business seems to be servicing big tech clients and the like who are flying in from the States or Europe, in and out all the time, and looking after them. And it seems as if what you've created, and I know you have an obscene amount of the Dublin hotel market already, but you've created a really nice product, seemingly at a good price, that facilitates FDI in doing business here.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things I would say is, you know, that we all need to understand what FDI is doing, and you talked to this, did it very well there. Like I spent an afternoon with James Lyons in Boston Scientific, and I was blown away by the experience. This is a phenomenal facility, and it is world class in terms of the way they do their business. And really, what brought it home to me was the culture of that business. It is phenomenally good, and the way they behave towards each other and the attitude. It is mind-blowingly good, I have to say. So,
is that a foreign culture, or is that an Irish culture?
Oh, I put it down as a James Lyons culture, essentially. And I suppose even some of the ways he does things in his business mirrors some of the things I do in my business. So the idea that we can't learn from each other is simply not true. I spent another full day in Google in Dublin when John Herlihy was the CEO. And again, looking at the way things work, and again, it's all about staying relevant. And I just love the structure. Like the medtech, which essentially Galway is the center of, like the growth in that and our positioning in the world now, like Galway medtech and other areas of Ireland where medtech is we have moved into number 2 in the world, behind Minneapolis, in terms of employment numbers and in terms of output. And so much so that if you have a piece of medical equipment put inside you somewhere, there's a 90% chance it's made in Ireland. And that's for anywhere in the world. It is a phenomenal success. And then when I hear people not loving it as much as they should do, I really, really get upset by that.
And how important is that? Is the local partnering then? When you're talking to these heads of FDI, obviously we have you know, we put it up there as the number one issue, when in my view it's not, is the benign tax environment that we create. But there's so much more there, and that Ireland offers. Can you talk a bit about the partnering, or what you're hearing from FDI in terms of partnering with local businesses to support them?
Let's just mention, you mentioned tax there and the corporation tax. And everybody was very focused on the Apple money, and it's pretty apt today because the EU are appealing the ruling on the 13 billion tax. And when you look at, if you go back over the last 5 years and you look at the corporation tax in Ireland and you look at the excess that we've taken each year above plan, above government plan, it's more than the Apple tax money when you put it all together. Like like this idea that multinationals don't pay tax is utter rubbish. And in reality, they are, when you look at, I think there's 10 companies that pay the vast bulk of our corporation tax in Ireland, and the vast bulk of those are FDI companies. So don't let anybody kid you and say that they're not paying their way, because they are. There's a lot of untruths in that. And I suppose what they rely on is what we call good infrastructure. And that good infrastructure includes lots of things. And obviously a good road infrastructure, you know, all of the water and the electricity and all the power that they need. But also what they need is a good educational system. And Ireland does that by and large pretty well. However, my belief is that there's a lot more to be done on this space, where we need to invest in education, and we need to invest in the proper types of education. And what you're finding is that you have almost, let's say even take Galway, you have an ecosystem where, you know, the universities will and should be producing people for all of these great medtech and biotech companies that you have in Galway. That's what should be happening. But equally, you know, I think sometimes our local authorities are pretty slow in recognizing the value of what having these companies on our doorstep means for not just the local environment, but for the entire country. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, that people have to realize the value before it's gone. Because if we don't take care of it, somebody else will, and somebody else will be thrilled to take care of it.
I'm always amazed at, I mean, the demand for, you know, educated people in Ireland, and the magnet that Ireland has become, a bit like Silicon Valley in the States, but for people from all over Europe, super educated, super able people coming to Ireland. And I'm in and out of Dublin a bit, and that city has just revolutionized itself from the city I remember back in the 80s and 90s. Now, some would say maybe it's lost a bit of the old flavor, and it's kind of more glitzy and maybe a bit more flavorless going forward. But I still think it's amazing what Dublin City has achieved there. And obviously it has bottlenecks as well. Is Dublin, a lot of your hotels are in Dublin, is Dublin a good template for other cities in Ireland to?
I like, Dublin has its faults like every city in the world, but by and large it's a pretty good template for other cities to emulate in Ireland. And I suppose, you know, I have 16 hotels with 4,500 rooms. So we are the biggest player in Dublin. And I suppose the bulk of my business is supporting the investment that all of these technology companies are making. The banking sector is a big part of our business. There's lots of different sectors that are part of our business. But if we can provide kind of these basics, then the rest, like people like Martin Shanahan from IDA, will struggle to attract, you know, the bulk of these companies that they have been so successful in attracting. And I think, you know, we need to bear that in mind, that when we're looking at other regions of Ireland, that we have that infrastructure for them, because they look at all sorts of things: quality of life, housing, Education obviously is a big thing for them, but they're the basic things they look at. And if that doesn't exist, then we're putting our whole structure under threat.
So what is Dublin City or Cork City or any, what are they doing that's good? What are they doing that's not good? What
Yeah, I find it very hard to criticize actually what anything that they have done. I suppose one of the big challenges we have in Dublin, no more and Cork to an extent, is housing, and that's fundamental. And we have dropped the ball in Ireland on that. And I remember back during those dark days after the 2007, 2008 crash, everybody was saying, you know, we've too many houses and, you know, we need to demolish them. The problem then, of course, is that they were all built in the wrong place in the first time. So what we need to do is make sure that our planning laws and that we can provide good housing in locations for people. Like you now probably have less people living between the canals in Dublin than ever in its history. And that should not be the case. The city centre, in order for it to survive and thrive, needs a good community living in the city centre. And part of the problem is that because of the cost of development of housing and all of that, we're shoving people more and more outside the city. And the fact that in many cases we don't allow enough height. And you know, I often look down on both sides of the river, and like it's probably a bit disgraceful that we wouldn't have done heights there, because you had the opportunity to do it along the river more than any other place. And it would have made lovely communities down there, but we have all this kind of flatline buildings which have no character in that sense, because they're not tall enough to give them. Like we all look at George's Quay, which is probably the tallest structure currently there, and everybody, they've become kind of iconic, whereas we could have had a lot more. And I think you know, even Cork has been better on height than Dublin, and allowed more height, and as a result have kept more people in the city centre. So there's a lot of things we could have done, and we just need to make sure that we get our planning right, and that we, I suppose, facilitate where people will want to live and work, and not to have these terrible commutes that I know they don't at the moment, but they will again.
But it seems like COVID is reversing the good work of bringing people into living in the city centre. It seems as if it's moving the other way now, that we know that rural property got a bit of a boost during COVID. People didn't want to live in the cities, and you know, we're looking at a couple of days a week in the office, and a couple of days working remotely. And the concern, or whether it's a concern or a good thing, is that may be a feature going forward into the future.
I think we need to be very careful on this, and what will happen, because there's a lot of talk about remote working and all of that, and that's fine for a time, but and during the kind of severe lockdown, companies were beginning to say, oh, this is going to work for us. However, even in the last number of weeks, there's been a fundamental change, because there are challenges around productivity. There are challenges about how people get mentored. How do we bring on the next generation? There's the issues of out of sight, out of mind. So if somebody is ambitious, you know, and they're living in somewhere in Westmeath, and their job is essentially in Dublin or even in Galway, you know, they're not there. They're not going to be in line of sight. So their opportunities will be limited. So I see lots of challenges coming down the road with this idea of this remote working. And I think offices will get back, because there's a need. And a lot of the things that we do now are collaborative by nature. And you simply can't do that as we're doing today on a Zoom call. You need the physical contact. You need the physical conversations going on, and the toing and froing of that conversation. So I'd say to people, be very careful about thinking that this might be the panacea for a lot of things. It'll work, and what you probably will end up with is a more hybrid model where you'll have some home working, but equally there will be times when everybody has to be in the office for a period of time. And of course, in my own business, of course, I can't do any remote working. Like, I can't tell somebody that I have the breakfast chef working from home today. It just simply won't work, because there'll be a lot of disappointed guests that'll be down there waiting for their bacon and sausage, and there's nobody there to cook it. So it doesn't work for me. And I'm kind of saying it's not going to work for other people either.
I agree. It's no panacea, but it does seem as if something has turned, and that we will be experiencing both, that there will be more remote working going forward, COVID or no COVID, and there will be more traveling then to the office. In terms of Dalata's business, I mean, if that is a real change as a result of COVID, and there are plenty more changes as a result of COVID, you know, like for instance, I can see people giving up their apartment in Dublin, relocating to the country, to regional areas, and maybe coming into the city for a few days a week and staying in your hotels.
We're actually already seeing that in London, where it's beginning to happen, where people have given up their accommodation in London and are using our hotels for 2 or 3 days a week. And so, like for me, in reality, you see, most of my business comes from people internationally flying in and out of the cities, whether it's Dublin, Cork, Limerick, or Galway. That's what my business is. It is not domestic. While domestic is good for leisure and weekend stuff, I need the midweek stuff, which is essentially the corporate international traveler, and that's what we need to get back. We're a long way off that for the moment. So it'll be a positive for, like, I don't see this as a negative for me if people work from home. I do see it a big negative for people who actually feel that it's going to work for them as a business.
And are people during the COVID crisis, are they comfortable staying in hotels?
Well, a quick review of my TripAdvisor comments. The answer to that is absolutely yes. And like the amount of positive comment coming through from my customers is extraordinarily high. And I suppose, like, one of the things we did, rather than rely on our own word, what we have engaged with Bureau Veritas, which is a Paris-based accreditation company that came in and accredited all our hotels before they could open. And that was one of the big deals for us. And particularly what we needed that for is for, and as the country opens up, we will need it for our US corporates, because they will need that level of accreditation. And what will actually happen is, where hotels have that, they'll tend to get the business as opposed to the ones that won't.
Are people more comfortable in general with movement, travel? Like, do you think that the measures, the government measures, and your own measures in terms of, I know you steam down the rooms and you disinfect, and your numbers of cases seem to be non-existent. Are people more comfortable with travel and staying in hotels? And is it because of the measures taken, or what's your sense of it?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because essentially, when you look at the movement in domestic travellers during July and August, and this is both for Ireland and the UK, was way ahead of where we thought it would be. And people, given the opportunity to travel, took it. And it was quite amazing. But again, it comes back to this thing of them feeling safe and comfortable. And there's always a balance in our business to make sure that they are not, I suppose, kind of overcome by our safety measures. So you're trying to balance the two things at all times. But by and large, are people comfortable with travel? And we've seen this a little bit in the UK, where some hotel companies did very little, and we've had movement of clients from those hotels to our hotels on the basis that they didn't feel safe in the hotels, who essentially tried to do it on the cheap, for want of a better word.
I know I'm itching to travel, be it work or leisure. I know a lot of others are really eager to get out and about, and as soon as we can. We used to use Airbnb a bit. That seems to have, for both regulatory legal reasons and really COVID, it seems to have disappeared in Dublin. How's that impacting you guys, or what's your views on that?
Well, you see, I suppose because Dublin was such a strong market, we probably didn't see any of it at all. Ironically, the only place we ever saw Airbnb in Ireland was during the Galway races, where people, there's a change in the profile of the attendees, where it's a much younger audience on some days. And essentially, they were much more prone to kind of using Airbnb locations. But again, what's happening worldwide is that Airbnb has essentially been found out. And the whole idea of Airbnb in the initial phases was you'd let a room in your house or your apartment, and you were the host. But what actually has crept into the market in a big way is what we call commercial Airbnbers. Like there's a case in Dublin where this guy he rented 40 apartments, and he then put them up on Airbnb. And he only got found out when there was a bit of a ruckus one night in one of the apartments, and of course the whole thing collapsed on him. But that was never the intention of Airbnb. And you have this issue across the world. You have it in Barcelona, you have it in Paris, Amsterdam, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and they're all, what has now come to fore is that the effect that that's been having on the housing market, and particularly apartments to rent. And what people were doing was moving away from renting to our own residents and renting to tourists. And then you had the phenomenon that we had to house homeless people in hotels, and we had tourists in apartments, which seems a bit ludicrous, quite frankly. But I think local authorities, and particularly the Irish government, have been very proactive in this. And even Airbnb themselves admit that the original idea has drifted away from the core. Like I'm all for the Airbnb where you do the sharing of the accommodation. Where you have a real problem with it is where it becomes commercial, and it's a hotel by another name, but without the regulation.
Yeah, I think that the defenders of it would say that, well, there just simply wasn't the capacity in the hotel space, too expensive, and that, you know, by not allowing this supply of rooms, then the tourism industry would lose out, you know. But I suppose
I don't buy that for a moment, quite honestly.
Yeah, but I suppose
as you'd expect me to say.
Exactly, yeah. But I suppose the answer comes back to business and infrastructure. You know, we need to supply the infrastructure at good prices to support business, whether it be FDI or whether it be tourism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we do a lot. Like we have a lot of different segments of our business. Like tour operating business represents about 15% of our business. Like it's a big business for us, and those guys are on their knees at the moment. But they're a critical part of the Irish tourism product. And, you know, we would hope that they'll all survive to get back to doing business again when international travel kicks back in again. And it's all of these things. And, you know, people talk about the city centres and the kind of, they're blaming the fact that people are out of their offices currently. But actually, one of the bigger problems, of course, is that we have no tourists who would be down in Grafton Street or Henry Street or Shop Street in Galway. Like nobody would think about it until they're gone. And of course, that's happened to a lot of businesses as well. They suddenly find, God, I was more involved in the tourism hospitality business than I thought, and suddenly that part is gone, and then they're struggling. So we've learned a lot from this crisis, and most of it is not pretty, but we've learned a lot.
Pat, we've a couple of questions from the audience, and some of them are kind of actually technical, and I kind of like the look of them. and they're to the theme of being in the hotel business. So identifying hotels. So just a couple of them to get a flavour, because we've only a few minutes, and so I'll lump a few together. And what methodology do you use in choosing, assessing hotels? How do you grow to the 40 hotels? I think you've covered a bit of that. Financing hotels in the early stages is difficult. We'll even talk about how you structure some of the deals. And then your managers are critical. I know you bang on loads about general managers, how important they are. So do you want to try and capture a few of those things?
I mean, of course, yeah. And it's a very good range of questions, actually. So essentially, just to move back to the way we manage our business, we have what we call a decentralized model. And essentially what will happen is we give full autonomy to our GM. So Dermot in Ormore, Rory in the Clayton, and would you believe I've forgotten her name and she'll kill me, in Sandy Road, Siobhan. Sorry, Siobhan. So essentially, we give them full autonomy to run their business and to make all the decisions around pricing, staffing, and all of that. So that's a critical part. And as a result, we grow our own people. I know it sounds like a vegetable patch, but it's not actually. It's about growing people within the organization. We're currently constructing 13 hotels, and all the management teams that will run those hotels are growing up inside Dalata today. So essentially, we build up that. But like what we do a lot of analysis on locations and where we will locate. So it is not just the fact to say that you'll be in wherever, in Manchester or Birmingham or whatever, and that it doesn't matter where you are in that city, it'll work as well for you. That's not true at all. So you have to be very careful about the actual choice of location where you put a hotel in the first instance. And then in terms of funding, obviously for most of our acquisitions, we raised the initial equity and debt to buy the original hotels. But now what we're doing is, rather than going back to shareholders to continually to fund the growth, we are using what we call fixed income providers. And these are essentially two German banks, Deca and Union. Then we have M&G out of London, Aberdeen Standard, Aviva. All of these people have essentially funds that they need to invest and they need to get a return on. And we're taking advantage of the fact that there's pretty low yields out there now, which means that our starting rent is low as a result of that. I don't want to get too technical on this, but essentially the lower the yield, the lower my rent will be at the entry point. And if it's lower at the entry point, we can control it all the way through the 30 years of its existence. So there's lots of money out there that essentially will allow us, I suppose, to develop the company at the pace that we can develop. So for us, being able to do that and being able to kind of focus on, I suppose, kind of building out the business, but with a very clear strategy around where we locate, how we operate, the brands that we put in there, whether it's a Clayton or a Malden, is absolutely critical to the sustainable growth of Dalata well into the future.
Is it fair to say that COVID is only a stopgap, in that you just need to be patient, you have the cash to meet the losses, and then you're primed for opportunity?
Well, actually, if I look at July and August, I didn't lose money at all, which in this July and August, which is a fantastic feat for the company. But I suppose it's to make sure we don't have cash burn. But essentially, if I look at, for us now, we are in a strong position, and because we have behaved well during the crisis, i.e. we've met all our obligations. What will happen as we come out of this? There will be the good guys and the not so good guys. And the good guys are going to be the beneficiaries of opportunities. And we are already beginning to see that. Hence, that was why we did the capital raise. So for us, having that reputation out there in the marketplace means that we will get deals that other people won't, because simply their behavior during the COVID, where they failed to meet their obligations, has meant that their covenants are shot to bits, whereas ours is as strong as ever.
Pat, JP is knocking on the door and he's saying that how long do you get in a dinner sitting again?
We get 1 hour and 45 minutes.
But it's only an hour here. JP, over to you.
Look, I think you'd all agree that I could certainly sit here for hours listening to Pat and Angus talk. Pat, I've been completely enthralled and engrossed in the conversation, and I won't put you on the spot, but certainly I think as we move through this period, I'd love to invite you back for another chat in the future, just to see how this current situation evolves. Look, I really appreciate your openness, your frankness, your authenticity, and I suppose the engaging nature of the discussion. I suppose you talked about all the various crises that we faced before, the oil, the Gulf, the .com, the 9/11s, the financial crisis, and the pandemic we're experiencing at the moment. That too will pass. And I suppose what the message I'm getting loud and clear from you today, Pat, is that it is going to pass, and we all need to be careful to plan for the opportunities that will arise, because success isn't an accident. It happens by good and careful planning, and I suppose very importantly too, I suppose is the need for each one of us to remain true to ourselves, to be authentic in ourselves, and remain resourceful and relevant. Relevancy, I suppose, was a really important theme that I took out of today's conversation. So look, it just falls to me to thank you very much for your valuable time today, and of course to Angus and the team at Grant Thornton for your continued support. It's very much appreciated at this time. And Pat, I wish you and the Dalata Group every success for the coming months, and I think the future is indeed very bright for you and your business. Thank you.
Could I just finish off by saying thank you to the people of Galway. You've always been great supporters. Hopefully you'll continue to be great supporters. We really appreciate the help. I lived and worked in Galway back in the mid-70s when I was driving around the city in my purple velvet Escort, thinking I was the bee's knees, as they say. So I have fond memories of Galway. You have a wonderful city there, but for God's sake, mind it and protect it with all your might.
Thank you, Pat.
Thanks, Pat. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Bye-bye.
Bye.